Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 15 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 15. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual running back, while also sharing with you guys a couple statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Before we get into today's video, a couple reminders. If you're looking for a specific running back, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you appreciate the timestamps, you appreciate the content, be sure to click the like button. And of course, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season in order to help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you for all the support. Okay, let's get into talking about matchups at the running back position. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing statistics allowed. This is rushing statistics in terms of rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. So regardless of what scoring format you play in, standard, half PPR, full PPR, you can identify the most advantageous matchups, which going into this week, throughout the spectrums of time of weeks 5 through 14, are the Arizona Cardinals, Indianapolis Colts, Carolina Panthers, Seattle Seahawks, New York Giants. Defenses that, of course, we want to start our running back going up against. Christian McCaffrey taking on the Arizona Cardinals, a fantastic matchup. Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren should have themselves a good time against the Indianapolis Colts run-stop defense. The Carolina Panthers, of course, will have their hands full with Bijan Robinson this week. Either way, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video. I also wanted to go ahead and mention some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the given week, because there are two sides to every single coin. Yes, there are going to be some advantageous matchups. There are going to be some matchups that we might want to avoid. Teams like the Chicago Bears, Minnesota Vikings, Atlanta Falcons, Houston Texans playing incredibly well in terms of stopping the run. Keep that in mind. A lot of these teams not even allowing 4 yards per carry to opposing running backs. And a team like the Atlanta Falcons, they haven't even allowed a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back thus far this season. Okay, with this all mentioned, let's go ahead and transition into our top 40 running back rankings. Again, top 40 because it is week 15. It is the fantasy playoffs. It's go big or go home. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention before we get into today's video, this upcoming Saturday and Sunday, on both days, I'll be live streaming here on the channel starting at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, there are games on Saturday and Sunday, so I'll have up-to-date rankings. We'll be answering questions for 3 hours, both overall streams, so keep that in mind. Be sure to swing on by. But for those of you guys who want my updated rankings for Saturday and Sunday, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, but for the next 2 weekends, also on Saturday mornings, because there are Saturday games that are implicated. So be sure to go ahead, take advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen, sign up today using code Andrew, make that first-time deposit, take advantage of course, putting together a couple pick'em slips, and get ready to draft some teams in terms of best ball for the NFL playoffs. All of that upcoming. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's get into talking about my top 40 running back rankings. With our number one, of course, it is Christian McCaffrey, coming off another incredible performance. Unfortunately, was not able to come away with a touchdown. Had himself 16 rushing attempts for 145 rushing yards. Literally the first play from scrimmage, for those of you guys who saw the game. He goes for 72 yards. The following play, they hand it off to Jordan Mason, the backup running back. He scores the touchdown. You know, it is the nature of the business. I mean, as of late, we have seen a lot of other, players within this offense scoring rushing touchdowns. Jordan Mason, of course, stole one. In the last couple weeks, Deebo Samuel has scored 4 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games. Of course, that is impacting Christian McCaffrey's overall success, but this upcoming week against the Arizona Cardinals should be able to dominate. Last time out against this defense, 4 total touchdowns scored, 45.2 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring from my last time out, 106 yards on the ground, 3 rushing touchdowns, 7 catches, 71, 1 receiving touchdown. I'm expecting a huge performance here from Christian McCaffrey. To begin the A tier, because I truly do believe Christian McCaffrey needs to be by himself in a lot of these conversations, we begin with Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. Kyren Williams is coming off another consecutive game in which he has played over 90% of the offensive snaps. We've gotten back to this one-back role where Royce Freeman is not getting himself any utilization or touches throughout the overall game. And on top of it, over the course of the last 2 games, 24 and 28 touches. This is workhorse level of opportunity. And of course, the Los Angeles Rams are playing extremely well as an offense. Over the course of the last 3 games, the Los Angeles Rams, since the return of Kyren Williams, have scored 37, 36, and 31 points as a team. As long as they continue to pile up huge point totals, of course, the implication is they're going to score some touchdowns. Matthew Stafford 10 passing touchdowns in the last 3 games. Kyren Williams has had himself a fair share amount of touchdowns. And going into this week against the Washington Commanders, the expectation would be, of course, a touchdown. Now, just this last week, he had an opportunity of falling into the end zone, even though he wasn't able to. He was tackled down at the 1-yard line. The following play, a false start by an offensive lineman, then a Cooper Kupp touchdown the play after that. It is unfortunate, but it is the nature of the beast. As we continue, we expect Kyren Williams to have himself a fantastic performance going into week 15. On number 3, Saquon Barkley, coming off an incredible performance last night against the Green Bay Packers run-stop defense, which is non-existent and has been non-existent for the last 3 years, as long as I can remember. Saquon Barkley coming off a game in which he had a huge uptick in terms of total opportunity on the ground, 20 rushing attempts, 86 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, still had himself a sprinkle of receiving work, 4 targets, 3 catches, 15 yards, 21 fantasy points. If he didn't fumble the ball, of course, would have had a little bit more fantasy points, but nonetheless, an incredible overall performance. Now, the primary reason why I believe that Saquon Barkley is going to be a great play going into this week, despite the fact that Tommy DeVito is getting himself utilization on the ground. I mean, whenever you have a quarterback that has the ability to damage a defense with their legs, it is going to open it up in terms of allowing Saquon Barkley to find more gaps within this defense. When the backside defensive end or linebacker has to respect Tommy DeVito keeping the ball, it is going to add even more depth within this offense, similar to the way in which they looked last season when Daniel Jones was running for over 800 yards within that given year. On top of that, the matchup against the New Orleans Saints, it is the 8th best at the position. They're allowing 15.28 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated since week 5. They're on a 3-game winning streak. I expect this to be a competitive game, and of course, for Saquon Barkley to have himself a great performance. On number 4 is Bijan Robinson, who's coming off another week in which he scored a touchdown. That's 3 of the last 4 weeks in which he has scored a rushing touchdown. Fantastic. Over the course of the last 4 games, 4 total touchdowns. We really can't ask for more. So going into this week, taking on the Carolina Panthers, considering they are the 3rd best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 18 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. Sure, we may see more of Cordero Patterson and or Tyler Algier within the overall matchup this week, but the expectation going into this week is a huge game from Bijan Robinson. Most recently, we have seen running backs like Deontay Foreman, 16.2 fantasy points. Tony Pollard, 16.0. Derrick Henry with 20.1. Rachaad White with 18.1. And Alvin Kamara with 12.0. Every single starting running back has put up double-digit fantasy points and found the end zone against this defense. My expectation would be that Bijan Robinson follows his suit and continues to put up another great performance here. On number 5 is Rachaad White. Speaking of Rachaad White, I mean, as of late, he has been unstoppable. In 2 of the last 3 games, over 100 rushing yards. In 4 of the last 6 games, over 20 rushing attempts. Workhorse level of opportunity on the ground through the air. This last week, 102 rushing yards. Had himself 2 receptions, 33 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. We talked about it last week in regards to the Atlanta Falcons not allowing a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back. And I said, luckily, Rachaad White gets himself a lot of utilization through the air. He might be able to fall into the end zone through the air, and that's exactly what took place within the receiving game. Now, over the course of the last 6 games, Rachaad White has been a different running back. He's averaging 18.02 fantasy points per game, and he has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 6 games. This week, again, they take on the Green Bay Packers, another one of these run-stop defenses that just honestly cannot stop the run. Over the course of this entire season, they have been gashed by great running backs, and considering how well Rachaad White has been playing and how much opportunity the Tampa Bay Buccaneers continue to give him, he should be a fantastic player as our number 5. Our number 6 is Derrick Henry, the thumbnail of today's episode. Now, besides the fact that he's coming off of 3 consecutive games of 2 touchdowns scored in each of those games, currently the number 4 overall running back in fantasy football in terms of a half PPR scoring format, that is correct. It is Derrick Henry. And this week, he has the privilege of taking on the Houston Texans. Over the course of the last 5 regular season games in which Derrick Henry has taken on the Houston Texans defense, he is averaging 33.28 half PPR fantasy points per game. These performances consist of 35.3, 17.6, 39.4, 35.0, 39.1. He's been able to go over 200 rushing yards in 4 of the last 5 games he's played against the Houston Texans. Now, those defenses in the past, 2022, 2021, 2019, 2020, all those overall defenses for the Houston Texans were different. They could not stop the run for their lives. But as of late, the Houston Texans defense really has turned it around. But if, in fact, we get into a situation this week in which this is going to be a competitive matchup, because, again, all of the receivers for the Houston Texans are injured. And if CJ Stroud cannot move the ball efficiently, perhaps if CJ Stroud is not even available for this game, considering he's in the concussion protocol, there may be an opportunity for Derrick Henry and the Tennessee Titans to run away with this matchup and have another consecutive game of 2 touchdowns within his overall scoreline. Moving on to our number 7 to begin the B tier. we have Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara and his overall performance from last week really wasn't contingent as to whether or not Taysom Hill was going to be active. Sure, he found himself in the end zone, 12 carries, 56 yards, and a touchdown. Wasn't able to get much success on the ground, only had himself 3 receptions, but negative 11 receiving yards. Again, those screen passes are going to hurt after a while. Nonetheless, this upcoming week, they take on the New York Giants. It's the 5th best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 16 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. He'll get back to an efficient receiving total. And not only that, with healthy pieces returning to this offense, Taysom Hill, Rashid Shaheed, I think it only elevates the potential of Alvin Kamara within a given week. Our number 8 is Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard, unfortunately, 3rd and goal, early in that game, was not in the backfield, and Rico Dowdle scored a rushing touchdown within this offense. It happens. We've seen it on multiple occasions over the course of this season where Rico Dowdle will come in and score a touchdown. Luckily for us, Tony Pollard was not only able to get himself 16 rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards, but 8 targets, 7 receptions, 37 receiving yards, 13.1 fantasy points in a half PPR. And obviously a huge week in terms of a full PPR scoring format, considering the 7 overall reception he was able to haul in. That tied his career high in terms of overall receptions within a given game. And as we continue, as long as he's going to get himself a high level of opportunity in terms of overall touches, again, 23 overall touches this last week, a touchdown will eventually be implicated. Now, there were 4 attempts for him to have a touchdown. In fact, there were 4 plays in which the Dallas Cowboys had the ball on the 5-yard line and in. On those 4 plays, 3 of them were passing attempts. 1 of them went in the direction of Rico Dowdle. Eventually, Tony Pollard will get back on track, scoring himself a touchdown. And even if he doesn't, he is still an efficient player considering the volume of touches he's getting within this offense, taking on the Buffalo Bills this week, which is an advantageous matchup. On number 9, we have Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon, I mean, who would have believed that it would take Joe Burrow exiting the team and being out for the remainder of the season for Joe Mixon to have himself unbelievable performances. Over the course of the last 3 weeks with Jake Browning, he has a game of 7.0 fantasy points, which is his worst game of the season this year. Then he has 2 performances, which are the 2 best thus far this season, 26.7 and 20.0. Who would have guessed that Jake Browning would be the reason why they unlocked Joe Mixon out of this backfield? Coming off a performance of 21 carries, 79 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, another week in which he gets himself receiving utilization, even while a guy like Chase Brown is catching the ball out of the backfield and going to the house, it doesn't matter. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, Joe Mixon, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 95 receiving yards. As long as he continues to pile up points there, taking on the Minnesota Vikings this week, if that Vikings offense cannot score, this could be a blowout in the favor of the Cincinnati Bengals offense. And of course, will lead to a lot of touchdowns for Joe Mixon. Not to mention, we've seen a guy like Jake Browning each of the last 2 weeks score a rushing touchdown. Imagine if those went in the direction of Joe Mixon, which they absolutely can within a given week. Our number 10 is Josh Jacobs. I truly do believe he will end up playing on Thursday. He is a tough son of a gun. Over the course of his entire career, he typically decides to play injured. You go back to last season, there were multiple instances throughout the entirety of that 2022 campaign where he was one of the top running backs in the league. Obviously went for the rushing title, in which he was injured but still decided to play hurt, obviously because he was vying for a contract. Either way, I think he's earning that contract over the course of the last 2 seasons. And going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, who he has a huge resume of success against, I'm expecting him to play. I don't expect him to be fully healthy, but they don't need him to be fully healthy going up against the team that does not have Justin Herbert on a Thursday night. Easton Stick will not have very many opportunities to, of course, build a rapport with that first team offense. It'll lead to the Las Vegas Raiders defense finding a lot of success, and of course, hopefully, the team handing the ball in the direction of Josh Jacobs and him dominating. If in fact he is not available for Thursday night, and my speculation is incorrect in terms of him being available, I would rank Jahmyr White within the overall RB 32 to 36 range. We'll talk about that in just a moment once we get there. Moving on to our number 11 to close out the B tier, we have Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert proved last night, and the Dolphins established that he is the RB1 of this team. It is apparent with his 21 rushing attempts for 96 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns that, they are really only going to utilize Devon Achane when they're in a situation in which they're up by a significant margin. Otherwise, late in that game, when they were given opportunities inside the red zone, due to the turnovers that the Tennessee Titans had late in that contest, they handed the ball off to Raheem Mostert and he went and found the end zone. If in fact they're going to continue to lean upon him, primarily because of Tyreek Hill's injury, you have to understand that yes, this offensive line is a little bit battered. Their center is out for the season. That's another starter for their offensive line that goes down this season. Hopefully they'll still be able to manage a great performance, especially going up against the New York Jets just a couple weeks back on Black Friday. Raheem Mostert in that game, 20 carries, 94 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, over 21 fantasy points against the Jets. He could very easily put up a performance such as that, but you got to remember that was without Achane. If we get into a situation in which the Jets get blown out, we get into the second half, expect Achane to get himself a fair share amount of overall carries. On number 12 this week, to close out the RB1 conversation, is Austin Ekeler. Now, going back to Sunday morning, many of you guys came into the live stream and said, hey, Andrew, have you seen the report from Ian Rappaport, who said specifically, hey, we are going to see far more touches from Isaiah Spiller and Joshua Kelly going into Sunday. And like I told you guys, any report that comes out about touches on a Sunday morning are typically to be disregarded, primarily because those reports are just put out as fodder. They really never come to fruition, and once again, it didn't come to fruition as Austin Ekeler had the vast majority of overall carries, 10 for 51 and a touchdown, 7 targets, 5 catches, 49 receiving yards, finally getting himself re-implemented within the receiving game. Going forward without Justin Herbert, it is going to be difficult, but like we saw in Sunday's game against the Denver Broncos, late in that game, in the 2-minute drill, in the kind of comeback scenario in which Easton Stick was trying to put together, he was not shy of throwing the ball in the direction of Austin Ekeler. Hopefully that continues to accumulate. Again, the Raiders thus far this season, they're allowing the 6th most points to opposing running backs, 15.66 on a per week basis since week 5. I would assume Austin Ekeler can maintain this RB1 conversation within the Thursday night matchup. Moving on to our number 13, Devon Achane. I wanted to mention Achane as an RB2, despite the fact that he was only given 12 carries last night against the Tennessee Titans. He was highly efficient with his overall touches. 9 total targets, which is a huge number that going forward definitely is going to play a role within his overall potential for upside. But going up against the New York Jets this week, if the Miami Dolphins are healthy in terms of Tyreek Hill, and they can manage to put up a huge performance once again against this secondary, my assumption would be that Devon Achane in the second half should be expected to get a vast majority of the overall touches as they try to protect Raheem Mostert for the remainder of the year. Raheem Mostert will dominate the touches in the first half. Devon Achane will be the guy in the second half, and you can't put it past them to potentially score 2 touchdowns in any given week as long as the game script is on their side. That's why I have him as my number 13. Number 14, we have Ezekiel Elliott. I never expected to have him in this conversation, but considering the volume of touches he had 29 total touches last Thursday against the Pittsburgh Steelers. That is the most touches he has had in a game since week 6 of 2019. Just putting that into perspective. Obviously, going into this weekend's matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, he's going to get himself a lot of overall touches. Now, he'll probably get himself somewhere between 12 to 17 rushing attempts. I doubt he gets to the 20-plus mark because they're not going to be in a positive game script, but he's going to get himself a lot of rushing attempts. But the primary reason why he currently sits here at number 14 is his receiving upside. He had 8 targets, 7 receptions, 72 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Played 91% of the offensive snaps. If we're going to see a high volume of receptions continue to go in the direction of Ezekiel Elliott, I truly do believe he's a top 15 back within the given week. My number 15 for this week, Jahmyr Gibbs, who came away with the lone touchdown out of the Detroit Lions backfield. I mean, we talked about it over the course of the last couple of weeks. Typically, David Montgomery was the guy that scored the touchdown every single week. Unfortunately, this last week was not the case. And in fact, on top of that, Jahmyr Gibbs even had more rushing attempts than David Montgomery, primarily because this game started out 10-0 in the favor of the Chicago Bears. For some reason, the Chicago Bears seem to be the kryptonite of the Detroit Lions offense and defense. Now, going forward, of course, they're not going to have to see them again. And going into this week, they take on the Denver Broncos. My expectation is that Jahmyr Gibbs will continue to get himself a high volume of opportunity, continues to play the vast majority of offensive snaps with this offense. And considering they take on the Denver Broncos, a defense that is allowing 5.25 yards per carry since week 5, I would assume that he's going to find himself a lot of success within the game. Now, I want to continue this conversation in regards to talking about the Detroit Lions backfield by continuing with David Montgomery as my number 16. David Montgomery, unfortunately, again, was not able to find the end zone, but both of these running backs have so much value considering the offense they're associated with, considering they have an extremely advantageous matchup taking on the Denver Broncos. I mean, if Austin Ekeler can get past his, downtrot of performances and have himself a resurgence of a week against the Denver Broncos, why not a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery both being able to come out with huge performances within a given week? I understand that David Montgomery not scoring a touchdown definitely hurt, but he was still able to get himself 10 fantasy points. If he's able to get himself a touchdown this upcoming week, we should be expecting 14 plus fantasy points, which is why I have him in this top 16 conversation. Moving on to our number 17, Travis Etienne. The issue that I have with Travis Etienne isn't the fact that he's been able to score touchdowns each of the last 2 weeks, which is obviously fantastic. It isn't the fact that he's been able to get himself 4+ receptions and 30+ receiving yards in each of the last 3 games, but it's the fact that unfortunately, his rushing yard totals are just not up there. Now, I wouldn't say these numbers are close to Breece Hall, but in terms of overall rushing totals as of late, 35, 45, 56, 52, 35, 79, 53, 55. Pretty much on a consistent basis, only getting himself 50 rushing yards per game. Very seldom is he finding himself within the 80 to 90, over 100 yard range. I think he's only been able to surpass over 100 rushing yards just once this season. So going into this weekend's matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, a defense that certainly can stop the run, I'm a little bit worried. But that being said, I just want to put it out there. Over the course of the last 4 games, the Baltimore Ravens have been weak in terms of stopping the run. We've seen Cleveland Browns running backs go for 139 and a touchdown, Cincinnati running backs 89 rushing yards on the ground, and just recently Kyren Williams and of course Royce Freeman combined for 123 rushing yards against that defense. There is a potential for more rushing yards, but all we truly want is for him to continue to score rushing touchdowns, continue to get his receiving work, and we won't be complaining going forward. On number 18, speaking of struggling in terms of rushing yard totals, we have Breece Hall. Finally was able to get himself a solid performance in terms of overall fantasy points based on the return of Zach Wilson. Now, we've talked about this, week over week. Since week 6, Breece Hall has pretty much been nullified in terms of his overall rushing statistics. Now, in terms of receiving statistics, that is where he finds all of his success. Coming off a performance of 9 targets, 8 catches, 86 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, playing 62% of the offensive snaps. Obviously was dealing with a little bit of an injury over the course of the week, was questionable as to whether or not he would play. Obviously played and got himself 18 total touches. Over the course of the last 3 games, he has 26 total targets. Over the course of the last 8 games total, 44 receptions, averaging over 5 receptions per game. What more can we ask for him in a negative game script taking on the Miami Dolphins? I'm expecting him to catch the ball a high volume of times and continue to succeed in that regard. Our number 19 for this week is James Cook, who's coming off a great overall performance, was able to find himself in the end zone once again, but not on the ground, but through the air. Over the course of this entire season, we have seen it. Josh Allen is going to be the guy that scores touchdowns for this team on the goal line. And going forward, I do not expect James Cook to find the end zone in that overall regard. But considering he's been able to get himself far more utilization in the receiving game since we have seen the offensive coordinator shift to Joe Brady. Over the course of the last 3 games, 16 targets, 14 receptions, 169 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. While speaking of Joe Brady, you got to remember, he was the former offensive coordinator of the Carolina Panthers from 2020 through 2021. He's utilized Christian McCaffrey throughout the receiving game. He knows how to get his talented running backs the ball, especially through the air. And going forward, I expect that to be the case. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys this week, this is not an easy matchup for the Buffalo Bills offense. If in fact they're trailing within this game, which is my expectation, they should be throwing the ball a bunch in the direction of James Cook, which will of course continue to accumulate yards and find himself fantasy success. Our number 20 for this week is DeAndre Swift. I'd love to rank him higher, especially considering this matchup. The Seattle Seahawks are the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing 17.01 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. But as of late, the Eagles' run game over the course of the last 2 weeks against the San Francisco 49ers and Dallas Cowboys has been nullified. So if in fact this team cannot find their footing, if their offensive line play is not going to improve and the running game isn't going to be a relevant, offensive piece, then can we really trust DeAndre Swift coming off a week in which he had 0 targets? I would hope that they're going to lean upon the running game. They're going to allow DeAndre Swift to continue to carry this team, much like in which they did earlier this season. I mean, this is a week in which he only had 11 total touches. We've talked about it all season. Earlier this year, he had a 10-game streak in which he had 15 or more touches. We got to get back to that overall range, give him opportunity, and find success within a given matchup. Our number 21 is Javonte Williams. I mentioned it last week. Touchdowns cure everything. And finally, for the first time this season, Javonte Williams scored a rushing touchdown. 17 carries, 66 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown. Continues to get himself utilization through the air. 4 targets, 3 catches, 25 yards, 16.6 fantasy points. Can we complain? Absolutely not. The opportunity volume is there with 20 total touches. The touchdown accompanied his overall performance. Otherwise, would have been a 10-point game. And I'm not going to complain about a 10-point performance, but of course, we want to find our workhorse running backs within the end zone. Going into this week against the Detroit Lions, again, it's not the easiest matchup. And especially considering the fact that Javonte Williams hasn't been the most efficient back in terms of running the ball over the course of the last 6 games, only averaging 3.52 yards per carry. I would assume this is going to be a little bit of a lesser week in comparison to the high upside that he found last week against the Los Angeles Chargers defense. On number 22, Zack Moss. Zack Moss once again had himself another game in which he had a lot of opportunity. Had himself 17 total touches, but unfortunately, only 7.6 fantasy points. Now, for those of you who didn't watch this game, unfortunately, he scored a rushing touchdown, but it was called back on a holding call on one of their offensive guards that, from my perspective, watching that game back, should have been a non-call. There was a non-existent holding call that somehow they threw a flag on, and they called back a touchdown for Zack Moss. Unfortunate to say the very least. Nonetheless, over the course of the last couple weeks, continues to get himself a high volume of opportunities. So as long as Jonathan Taylor is going to be missing, I expect him to, at a base minimum, get himself 10 fantasy points. If he scores a touchdown, he's close to that RB1 conversation within a given week. Coming away with 8 total targets last week is no joke. Hopefully they continue to utilize him in that overall capacity. Moving on to our number 23, Ty Chandler. The player that I mentioned as my number 1 in yesterday's waiver wire episode. In the absence of Alexander Mattison, the expectation should be that Ty Chandler gets himself a lot of opportunities, especially considering when we take into account over the course of the last 3 games, running backs for the Minnesota Vikings have totaled 24 carries for 104 rushing yards, 14 carries for 60, and 28 for 154. If we're going to get the running backs the ball about 20 times over the course of this game against the Cincinnati Bengals, a defense that is allowing the 13th most points to opposing running backs, 13.36 since week 5, allowing 4.22 yards per carry on average, I would assume that Ty Chandler on the ground through the air can find himself a lot of success. And with this team transitioning away from Josh Dobbs and the potential of Justin Jefferson missing, of course, they're going to have to continue to lean upon the running game with a less mobile quarterback and not as many receiving options down the field in order to help them out. My number 24 for this week is Chuba Hubbard. Since the firing of Frank Reich, Chuba Hubbard has had himself 25 and 23 rushing attempts. Ridiculously high numbers. Obviously, this week he takes on the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons have not allowed a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back all season long. And if that continues to stay pat, of course, Chuba Hubbard would pretty much be assumed to maybe score himself 10 to 12 points this given week in terms of overall yardage, receptions, and receiving work. That in itself is a pretty solid number. The volume of opportunity he continues to get wouldn't surprise me if he's the running back to break the streak and fall into the end zone against the Falcons defense. Number 25. We have Kenneth Walker. As long as Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet are going to continue to be splitting overall snaps and touches, it is going to negatively impact Kenneth Walker. Now, this week they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. His ranking is 100% contingent on whether or not we see Geno Smith out there. If it's going to be Drew Lock for another consecutive game, I'd expect this team to be passing the entire time, which in the case of Kenneth Walker isn't a bad thing. 5 targets, 4 catches, 33 yards was the most overall success he found within that overall game last week against the 49ers. But hopefully Geno Smith is healthy this week. He's available. And if in fact he is, Kenneth Walker would be a better play than number 25. As of right now, not 100% certain as to whether or not Geno Smith is going to be active this week. And considering the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, I don't really trust the overall scenario right now. My number 26 for this week, Najee Harris, who should have himself a far better performance than what he put up last week against the New England Patriots. But as of late, the entire conversation within this backfield is which of these 2 running backs is going to find success? Because we've seen weeks in which it's Najee Harris. We've seen weeks in which it's Jaylen Warren. Weeks in which it's been both. But going into this week against the Indianapolis Colts, a top 2 matchup at the position, a defense that is nearly allowing 18 fantasy points per game, the question is, can Najee Harris get back on track? And I would say yes, if in fact he falls into the end zone. Now, as of late, in terms of overall opportunity, he has had himself 87 total rushing attempts and 16 total targets since week 9. Throughout that same span of time, Jaylen Warren has himself 33 less overall rushing attempts, but 5 more overall targets. As long as Najee Harris is going to be the preferred overall running back within this overall matchup with Mitchell Trubisky as their quarterback, I would assume that they lean upon the running game that much more. They're taking on a defense that has allowed 104 and a touchdown to Cincinnati running backs, 177 and 2 touchdowns to Tennessee Titans running backs, 111 to Tampa Bay running backs, and 142 to New England Patriots running backs. I would assume that the Indianapolis Colts run-stop defense, once again, is not able to stop the run and allows Najee Harris to gather himself a high volume of points. Number 27, we have Bijan Robinson. Last time out against the Miami Dolphins, left the game due to a hamstring injury. Obviously, luckily for him, he was able to have himself a bye week in week 14. So hopefully going back this week, will be healthy and will be able to practice and be at a full capacity. Over the course of the last 2 games in which the Washington Commanders have played, there have been 3 instances in which Sam Howell scores a rushing touchdown that is stolen away from Bijan Robinson. These are rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line, which is unfortunate to see, 2 of which were on the goal line. But nonetheless, I'm expecting Bijan Robinson hopefully to find himself in the end zone, but at least at a bare minimum, find himself a high volume of touches and receiving work to still be an RB3 option within the given week. On number 28 is Jerome Ford. Speaking of finding receiving upside, Jerome Ford with the assistance of Joe Flacco, coming off another great performance in which he's able to surpass 10 fantasy points because of the receiving work. Back in week 13, had himself a receiving touchdown. This week, 5 catches, 31 receiving yards, on top of the fact that he had 51 on the ground. Over the course of the last 2 games, Joe Flacco has had himself 44 and 45 passing attempts. That is the most passing attempts a quarterback has had for the Cleveland Browns all season long in comparison to DTR, Watson, and PJ Walker. This offense has transformed. They're continuing to pass the ball with both of their offensive tackles out, going up against the Chicago Bears. It should be more of a difficult matchup considering the Chicago Bears have allowed the fewest fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated since week 5. But considering the all-pro nature of the interior of the Cleveland Browns offensive line, I still think they're going to find a lot of success on the ground. But what separates Jerome Ford from the pack is his receiving work. Moving on to our number 29, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Under the assumption that Isaiah Pacheco is missing this week, Clyde Edwards against the New England Patriots, a matchup in which they should be blowing out this defense and finding themselves a lot of success, I would assume that CEH in the second half should be able to gather himself a lot of rushing yards and, of course, potentially a touchdown. This last week, unfortunately, inside the 5-yard line, had a touchdown stolen away from him from Jerick McKinnon. But if, in fact, Isaiah Pacheco is active this week, I would rank him as a top 15 running back, probably ahead of Ezekiel Elliott within the overall week. Moving on to our number 30, we have Devin Singletary. Every other week, it's a different running back within this backfield. Week 14, of course, it was Devin Singletary, 13 carries, 65 and a touchdown. The week prior, 15 carries in the direction of Dameon Pierce, in which he found the end zone. I don't know what to do with this backfield. I would assume that going forward within this given matchup, considering the injuries that have taken place within this offense, they would prefer to have Devin Singletary on the field more often than not, primarily because he is a more dependable receiving back within this backfield. Luckily for Singletary, the Titans are the 9th best matchup at the position. Obviously, last night got torched by Achane and, of course, Raheem Mostert on the ground, averaging over 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. My assumption would be a solid week as a top 30 option. But again, so much inconsistency of overall touches within this backfield makes it sketchy. Our number 31 is Jaylen Warren. We would like to hope that Jaylen Warren gets himself more upside than he has presented over the course of the last 3 games, has only been able to score himself 6 or fewer fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. Those are not great numbers, but luckily this week has an opportunity of taking on the Colts defense that is nearly allowing 18 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, the second best matchup. And like I mentioned with Najee Harris just moments ago, in regards to running backs finding success recently against this defense, 142 yards from New England Patriots running backs, 111 from Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs, Tennessee Titans running backs, 177 and 2 touchdowns, Cincinnati 104 and a touchdown. My expectation, hopefully, is opportunity, but efficiency with those overall opportunities within the given week. Moving on to our number 32, we have Aaron Jones. My assumption, based on the fact that he was limited throughout practice all of last week, if in fact he's active, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a defense that has struggled in terms of stopping the run as of late, my assumption would be that Aaron Jones would be limited in his overall touches, splitting them with A.J. Dillon, but he would dominate the receiving workload and still be relevant in that overall capacity. Obviously, the backfield of the Green Bay Packers has not been at the level which it's been in the past in terms of scoring touchdowns, considering the efficiency of this offense. So I don't expect to see touchdown upside, but I do expect 10 plus touches and, of course, 5 plus receptions, hopefully within this given week. Moving on to our number 33, we have James Conner. James Conner taking on the San Francisco 49ers is not an easy task. Luckily, last time out, we saw him against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a revenge game, 105 and 2 touchdowns, 22 and a half fantasy points. Now, his last performance against the San Francisco 49ers in week 4, 11 carries for 52 on the ground, a pretty decent yard per carry average, but only 1 reception and 6.1 fantasy points. I would not expect to see a high volume of production, especially going up against that defense that is nullifying every single running back that they come into contact with as of late. Therefore, I have James Conner as my number 33, unless he's able to get himself a huge workload of opportunity within the receiving game. On number 34 is D'Onta Foreman. Like I mentioned yesterday in the waiver wire episode, in comparison to the other running backs of this offense, he is getting a vast majority of the overall snaps, 55% last week. Touches, 13 overall touches in comparison to the handful that Roschon Johnson and, of course, Khalil Herbert are able to accumulate as a duo. Going forward, taking on the Cleveland Browns, a defense that is the 10th best matchup at the position, 14.4 fantasy points per game since week 5. I would assume that the Chicago Bears offense wants to establish the run. And considering how efficient Justin Fields has been on the ground himself as of late, it opens up even more opportunities for D'Onta Foreman to find extra gaps within this defense that is definitely struggling in their run-stop efforts. Moving on to our number 35, we have Tyjae Spears, coming off another incredible performance. This is back-to-back weeks in which he's a top 20 running back in a half PPR scoring format. Obviously, a lot of the overall production from last night was in the receiving game. 6 receptions, 89 receiving yards, Obviously, 14.8 half PPR fantasy points. They take on the Texans that have been riddled with injuries on the offensive side of the ball. If, in fact, CJ Stroud is not available and Davis Mills is starting, there's no Nico Collins, there's no Tank Dell, there's no Dalton Schultz potentially. I think this will be a feast for the Tennessee Titans offense to dominate against that defense, just similar in the way in which the Jets dominated against that defense in the second half of last week's game. Moving on to our number 36, we have Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens. At this current juncture, I believe that Gus Edwards is a non-starting option going forward. Keaton Mitchell continues for another consecutive game to have more snaps and more touches than Gus Edwards. Neither of these overall running backs are scoring touchdowns, as it seems that Lamar Jackson is airing it out far more often. But Keaton Mitchell will always have an opportunity of a breakout performance, considering he's always getting himself more touches on the ground and, of course, has the potential of the receiving game elevating his overall performance. So as of right now, tough matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a low-end RB3. Moving on to our number 37, a player that can, in any given week, score a singular touchdown and make his performance, just like last week. 9.5 fantasy points. Well, of course, 6 of those points via a touchdown. Otherwise, only had 10 carries for 27 rushing yards, 1 reception for 3 receiving yards. Not the greatest overall game, but as long as he maintains the goal line work of this offense, of course, will continue to be relevant for fantasy purposes. Against a solid run-stop defense this week, does worry me, but they will be playing at home, which gives them a little bit of an advantage. Our number 38 for this week is Jerick McKinnon. Besides the fact that he stole a touchdown last week, really didn't do much. Only 4 carries for 19 yards, 3 receptions for 18 yards. Clear and away, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to get himself a vast majority of the touches, and going forward, as long as that is the case, maybe Jerick McKinnon finds himself a lucky touchdown once again, considering they play against the Patriots. Patrick Mahomes is pissed and maybe wants to go ahead and come out with a big performance. Nonetheless, Jerick McKinnon still this RB4 going forward in my eyes. Our number 39 for this week is A.J. Dillon. In the return of Aaron Jones, assuming Aaron Jones does in fact return, A.J. Dillon will get himself less touches, less opportunity, and as long as he continues to not score touchdowns, again, an RB4 going forward in this capacity. The final running back I wanted to mention is Antonio Gibson. If in fact Bijan Robinson is not healthy from the hamstring and is limited in any sort of capacity, Antonio Gibson should be a value over the course of the last 4 games. I mean, there have been 3 different performances in which Antonio Gibson is the number 30 or better overall running back within those given weeks. So my assumption going into this week, Antonio Gibson should have himself more value, especially a game in which they should be in a negative game script, finding himself a lot of receiving work. Okay, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 40 running back rankings for week 15 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed today's content, you enjoy the timestamps, all that kind of jazz, be sure to click the like button. I greatly appreciate it. I'll be back tomorrow with my top 40 wide receiver rankings, maybe top 45. We'll end up seeing. Either way, I'll be back tomorrow with wide receiver rankings for week 15. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.